Martin, as the FT's chief economic commentator, you are a long-time China watcher. And to
That is
you,
true.
Is there a big China riddle that makes China very difficult to describe or comment?
China is a very, very large and complex country, and inevitably one's view of such a country is very partial and incomplete. That itself makes it difficult to understand. And ultimately, one knows one never fully understands anywhere. I mean, I'm often asked whether I understand Britain, and I don't, so why should I understand China? There are other more fascinating puzzles about China which are specific to China. You have an incredibly rapid modernization process, unbelievably rapid modernization process in a very ancient civilization. That's unique. And the final, which I think is the core riddle for the West, is the contrast between a Communist Party run system. For us, the Communist Party, communism is a very strange ideology. Remember, it was a Western ideology, which the West rejected. It's a very strange. Here it is in China, this ancient civilization which says it's communist. We don't understand what that means. How can that possibly be really the case? How does that work? So you've got this political system which is centralizing and anti-democratic, obviously in principle, and this very dynamic market-cum-state-led economy, which again is unique. That seems a strange contrast to us. How do you have a capitalist market economy in a communist country? It's a fundamental enigma. So making sense of this is very difficult. The assumption of most Westerners had been that as China developed, became richer, more middle class, more educated, it would tend to become politically more like us. That's what we assumed. As did happen, in fact, in Korea and Japan ultimately. But it doesn't seem to be happening. So that's a real riddle.
When you write stories or commentaries about China, do you apply the same kind of economic principles, values, standards? Or is China fundamentally so different that you develop another way of looking at it?
I'm not an imperialist as an economist. I don't think economics is everything. But there are basic ideas in economics which are, I think, universally applicable. The core idea in economics, I suppose, the central is the profit motive, the motive of people pursuing gain, not just in companies, but also individuals. And to be honest, one uses that in China, and I must say it works pretty well. It seems to me the Chinese are very profit-seeking. If you look at the Chinese people around the world and in China, they know how to run businesses incredibly well. They are a very highly competent mercantile commercial people. So I think there's no difficulty about using standard economic ideas in terms of development and growth. The core ideas are human and physical capital and innovation, right? Well, China has the highest investment rate, as far as we can see, of any country ever. So standard economics about physical capital and investment apply. The Chinese are incredibly motivated about education. That's human capital, so that applies perfectly well. And China is really very dedicated to innovation, to technological upgrading, to importing new ideas and developing them. So these are all completely applicable. Remember, West contains many different capitalisms. So, German capitalism is not like American capitalism. We're used to the idea that there are many different ways. Japanese capitalism is different again. I would say China is different again, but it's not so much more different than Japan is from America. So it's important to understand that. It's not that unique. But the political structure is obviously very different. And the second point is in discussing developing countries, and China is still a developing country, it's still a relatively poor country, there are certain characteristics which are different from advanced countries. Potential growth is higher, the nature of you've got a rapid urbanization process, so you have to look at the urbanization process. We don't have an urbanization process, we're urban. But in China, this is all new. There's still a very large rural economy in China. That wouldn't be relevant for most developed countries. So there are questions that are relevant to China because it's a developing country. It makes it more, as I said already, like other East Asian countries, which have also gone through this incredibly rapid industrialization. But China, in its scale and speed, is of course unique.
Because China is so unique, and China is quite notorious for its statistics, so many economists who developed their own so-called methodology to analyze the real situation, the real growth of Chinese economy. Do you have such a secret weapon, like looking at the price of pork, for example?
No, I don't. I think the broad growth statistics are correct. I have less confidence of the statistics in any given year. So I think that Chinese statistics have tended to understate booms and also understate slumps, so that I suspect the economy, in fact, has been a bit more cyclically unstable than has been shown. And I think there are very powerful reasons why that. You have to meet the target, so you meet the target. I think there is a tendency of that. The statistics are produced so quickly, nobody can believe that they're accurate in that time. If even small Western countries with very large statistical offices, it takes much longer to produce the statistics, particularly the GDP statistics, and they're revised again and again. The Chinese statistics cannot be that reliable. But so I think the short-term fluctuations are understated. But the reason I believe that they're clearly valid overall is, first, you can look around. It's obvious. If you've been coming to China, as I have been for 25 years, it's obvious that it's changed dramatically. But the other thing that we do know is the international statistics. So the trade, we know, foreign direct investment, we know about these statistics because they've got an international check. The trade growth has been so dramatic, particularly up to the crisis. It's clear that it implies massive GDP growth. If it weren't, China would have become the most open society in world history, even though it's so big. Even as it is, it was incredibly open. The trade ratios were so high. So it seems to me we have very clear corroboration of the overall growth story, not necessarily quarter to quarter, or not quarter to year to year. That might not be so reliable, but the broad story is, I think, clearly very credible. Now, in terms of my own favorite statistics, I mean, obviously I look at some of the other people who've done analysis which is focused on specifically, there's something called the Li Keqiang index, which you probably know about. But the way I think about this is a slightly different way. I'm not saying this is reliable, but in the long run, the growth of welfare is correlated with the growth in consumption. Okay? That's the base. Adam Smith taught us that the aim of production is consumption. I think that particularly in the last 15 years, and increasingly so, there's been a lot of wasteful investment. So quite a bit of investment, which is part of GDP, it's legitimately part of GDP, is probably not welfare enhancing. And so if you look at GDP as a welfare measure, you should ignore it. So it seems to me better to look at the growth of consumption. Now, if you look at the growth of consumption, you'll find that in the boom period, it was considerably slower than GDP. Not a couple of percentage points. Now it's faster than GDP. I think that's about right. I think that suggests to me that quite a fair part of the growth prior to perhaps 2010, 12, something like that, was a bit wasteful, not real increasing welfare. And now, actually, true growth, consumption growth, is faster. And I think, so looking at consumption is quite a good measure of welfare. Of course, and this is a very final comment, there are very important things that GDP doesn't include. It doesn't include, we know it doesn't include. The most important of these are environmental effects. In the past, of course, China's GDP statistics, obviously understated the huge rise in pollution and the extraction in resources. This seems to be getting better. That makes GDP, leaving aside my point about investment against consumption, consumption against investment, a defective measure of welfare, and one has to be aware of that.
So many Chinese people have this perception that Western media have a biased view, or hold biased views against China. For example, they come to China with a sense of sort of superiority. They look at China's so-called negative sides much more often than they look at the positive sides. Do you think there is a distinction between positive coverage of a country and negative coverage of a country?
Well, the views that Chinese people have of Western media are very similar, but probably not as hostile as the views of many of our politicians of Western media. Nowadays, everybody seems to hate the Western media, so it's not unique at all to China. I don't consider myself an expert on the coverage because I don't read it all. First of all, there's a structural feature about news. It's a very interesting feature of the news business as a business. I imagine it applies within China too, that people, and this goes ultimately down to the consumers, the people who read it and use it. People are much more excited and engaged by negative stories than positive stories. So if there's a disaster somewhere in the world, it will be in the front page press. If something goes incredibly well, it won't be in the press at all, because the press focuses on disasters. It's particularly true of political coverage, but also social coverage. So there's a general tendency for the news media to focus on negative stories everywhere. And it's one of the reasons people sort of hate newspapers. So I think that's not unique to our coverage of China. It's very much a characteristic of our coverage of our own countries. The negative is always dominant. And second, I suppose the news media think of themselves as, perhaps in exaggeration, a sort of there to be a check on power, hold power accountable. So there's a tendency to say, well, the people in power say X, why is X wrong? And that's probably regarded as particularly controversial here because the Chinese government likes to control the media. And so they see, understandably, from their point of view, the media running around saying, but you say X about your country and it isn't true, get to be very unpopular. Those are, if you like, general phenomena, not unique to China in any way. So politicians hate media everywhere. I think it's very important. I'm not saying the people, they vary. But generally, by the way, in the West, journalists are regarded as a pretty low form of life. So there's nothing special. Now, the question of the Western approach to China is I think it probably goes beyond the media, but far beyond the media. How does the West view China broadly? It's difficult to summarize, of course, because it's so complicated and people have different views. But the media imports certain attitudes. Media are by and large written by liberal, in the American sense, Westerners. And they probably have the following sorts of attitudes. They don't much like the Chinese political system, instinctively, as I've said. We don't find the idea of a communist country very easy to understand or accept. And it is important to remember the Cold War was important. And the Cold War was a conflict between democracy and communism and was seen as an ideological conflict. So in that context, the political system of China was on the other side. So people are very suspicious of that. Until recently, it's perhaps a bit less now, Westerners tended to think democracy was a better system. Maybe we don't think that, but that's an issue. Then, obviously, the government here likes to put forward the immense achievements, which are obviously immense economically. But there are lots of problems in China, and it's natural for the media to want to go around and find out about the problems, because as I said, bad news is the story. And it's particularly natural that they want to do this when the government is touting all the successes. So they go around looking for the bad stories. That's part of what they think of as their job. They do this in the West very much so. So it's nothing unique. I don't think that's unique. The suspicion of the political system is specific to China. Now, a more interesting question is there a tendency to be particularly hostile to features of the Chinese social culture and so forth? I don't know. There are some issues that probably have arisen in the Western media, gender issues, for example, which I think are in no ways unique in the attitude to China, but are seen as important to the West because the West is very fixated on gender issues now. So bias in the sex ratio between men and women is an issue for the West and observers of China. That's probably inevitable. So we look through China through modern Western eyes, and modern Western eyes are very different from those of 60, 70 years ago. We have our own concerns, and everybody looks at this country in terms of our own preoccupations of the moment, which change. Now, the final issue, which I think let's be honest about, is we have to be careful about. And I do wonder about this, which is how much of the coverage of the view of the West of China is governed by fear. I mean, this is an interesting question. China is an enormous country. It is going to be enormously powerful. Almost certainly, it will be the world's biggest economic power. It will therefore become a dominant political factor in the world. This makes it's a non-Western country, will always be a non-Western country. I think it frightens Westerners. The Westerners have been they've got completely used to instinctively, as it were, it's not an instinct, but to running the world. They think in some strange way that it's natural. They don't want to lose this position, but China is clearly going to change that. And so it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the points I made about the political system, the feeling that it's not a natural political system, the hostility to it, that's, as it were, contingent upon very specific things. But the fundamental question is, do we find the rise of China exhilarating but also terrifying? I think the answer to that is most intelligent observers find it exhilarating but also terrifying because we don't know what it's going to mean for our world.
You talked about the sense of superiority. If there were a sense of superiority felt among Westerners, has this gone totally now with what's happened in the West in 2016?
I can't speak for all Westerners any more than I could understand all Chinese people. There are so many different attitudes. Most people in the West, believe it or not, don't think about China at all, from one day to the next. This question of superiority is complex and it changes over time. There used to be an idea that, this is a long time ago, that the West was so fundamentally superior, as it were, culturally, possibly even racially, that China just couldn't compete. 100 years ago, people thought these ludicrous ideas, completely absurd. Now, if you go back to that, then already by 30, 40 years ago, the success of neighboring economies had sort of challenged those ideas. For example, the quite widely held view that development, modern industrialization, was a unique product of Western culture. By 1980, with the rise of Japan, the rise of Korea, the rise of Singapore, Hong Kong, that had vanished to a substantial degree. China has just confirmed this on a bigger scale. So that sense of superiority is gone. I think it's still probably the case that the most successful Western nations consider themselves to be more advanced, more economically innovative. I mean, the Americans still certainly consider that. Their economic civilization is the most advanced and dynamic in the world. And they probably still believe that, but they certainly don't believe it to anything like the degree they did 30, 40 years ago. And the rise of China has confirmed that. In that sense, the sense of superiority is gone. Now, we did think that we had, and this is relevant to your question, as it were, the normative political system of the world. Ours was the normative set of political values for the world, that liberal democracy was the right way to govern the world. I suppose that the events of the last year or two raise the question of whether that's true. We've clearly made some pretty massive mistakes, and we put in power in America, particularly somebody who's wildly unsuited for it. And that it is perfectly legitimate to ask, does our system work anymore? And it's perfectly legitimate for the Chinese to ask that of us, and it's legitimate for us to ask that of ourselves. So I would have thought it would be sensible to ask whether we have anything to feel so confident about. But I'm not sure we've got to the point yet of really doubting it. I mean, my own view would be that I would certainly regard going to your system as infeasible, and I would also certainly say it will be undesirable. But I think the question of whether we can make democracy work adequately is a perfectly good one now.
I've read some of your columns written in the past year. You seem to be quite upset about what's happened in the UK, in the US. And in China, there's also, two completely different kinds of views about what happened in the West. One camp thinks that given the Brexit, given Trump, capitalism and democracy are failing in the West. The other camp thinks, what happened was a sign of democracy at work. So what's your view on this?
I suppose you could say both are true in the sense that this happened as a result of the failure of the governments to deliver what the people want. And so a lot on the second interpretation will depend on what happens now. My own view is that the populists who've got into power, particularly in America, don't have any good answers. So if you're an optimist, you could say the questions are now clear. These people will not produce the answers. They will fail. And then we will possibly elect people who will do a better job of dealing with the problem. Now that's the optimistic view, and that would suggest that democracy is still a creative system. It's imperfect, but it adjusts to reality, and ultimately it will produce better outcomes. And democracy is a better way of getting there than having a violent revolution. The argument for democracy ultimately is it's about the civilized transfer of power when change is needed. And the question, obviously, in a non-democratic system is in any non-democracy, how do you preserve legitimacy if you don't have elections? How do you change policy when policy has to be changed? And how do you prevent ossification, bureaucratic ossification? Those are all relevant questions for China. I think it's pretty clear those are relevant questions for China. But our question is, can we bring about competent leadership? The question in democracy always is, what happens if the people elect fools? That's obviously the great risk, and that's happened. On the first camp, my answer would be, so that's the second camp might be proved right. The first camp, I would say that the failures of capitalism and democracy are linked in the sense that it started with capitalism. It started with the financial crisis. And that shouldn't have happened, and that was a mistake of government policy vis-a-vis financial markets, and it has underlined the instability of financial markets. It's an aspect of capitalism, a very important one, but not the only one. That's a core thing. It's about how capitalism works. Democracy has found it difficult to deal with this, to respond to that. It's still finding it very, very difficult. There is a tension between democracy and capitalism, so it's perfectly legitimate to ask, could we have capitalism without democracy? It's conceivable. I think it's very difficult. In the long run, I think it's very difficult. But if we're going to try and keep capitalism and democracy together, we have to have to converge on a system of capitalism that is less unstable, and we have to find a democracy that produces reasonably competent leaders. That's not going to be easy. I recognize that challenge, and I think the question that the Camp 1 is raising is a perfectly good question, very good question, and we'll see if we can come up with good answers. I don't believe in the durability and the success in the long run of, if you like, autocratic and non-democratic capitalism either. There are very few examples. There is no advanced country in terms of income per head which is an authoritarian capitalist state. China is still a relatively poor country even today, so we don't know what it'll look like 60 years from now. So if 60 years from now China is an advanced capitalist state, I won't be alive to see it, but if it is, it'll be very interesting to see whether it has the same political structure. I must say I would remain of the view that it would really surprise me if 50 or 60, I won't be around to see it, 50, 60 years from now, China has essentially the same political structure with an advanced capitalist economy. So I tend to think in the end, an advanced capitalist economy is likely to need some sort of democratic processes, and the question is whether we can achieve ones that work.
Quick question, quick answer. Which Chinese person do you most want to interview?
The president, I would have thought.
Naturally, if you were summoned to Xi Jinping's office and asked to give him one piece of advice on how to run China,
oh my
what
God,
would that be?
I'd probably say take a gamble on economic and political reform.
Economists make predictions, and of course you do, often. Has China proved you wrong in the past?
I try very hard not to make predictions. Yes, China has proved me wrong in the past.
How many times? Often?
I have underestimated the ability of the governing system to manage economic challenges in the short to medium term.
What's the biggest joy of being a columnist who gets to write and publish and talk to their readers, every week?
Simply the freedom to express your ideas for lots of people. It's very, very enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you.
Pleasure.